Hi, welcome to this clip on audit and assurance standards. Audit and assurance standards ensure that when we are going to conduct an audit, we will follow the professional standards mandated by ISACA. ISACA has put together a list of information systems audit and assurance standards that must be followed in order to conduct a professional and skillful audit. Audit standards themselves are mandatory requirements. We are required to apply and adhere to these in the conduct of an audit. They state what are the minimum levels of acceptable performance of the auditor during the engagement, as well as the expectations of management and other parties in regard to then the conduct and reporting of the actual audit. Let's take a look at some definitions. We have a number of tools and techniques that we can use that will help us then in conducting an audit. These will help us then to ensure that the audit was conducted in accordance with the standards required of us. These standards being mandatory requirements for audit, as well as then for assurance to management and reporting. In order to meet these standards, we'll often then use guidelines. Guidelines provide guidance or information that we can use on how to meet then the requirement of the standard, how to be compliant with the expectations of management as a professional auditor. There are three different categories of standards and guidelines that we will look at. ISAC has defined the general then standards and guidelines, which are guiding principles for information systems assurance on how to conduct then audit assignments. These apply to all audits and of course to all then areas of the business. We then have specific standards and guidelines related to performance. This details how to actually conduct the actual audit assignment, including then the planning of the audit, the supervision of the audit work, and the scope of the audit. Then we have standards related to then reporting, the types of reports we must then generate as a result of the audit, and the means by which we will communicate with management and other interested parties. Let's take a look then at some of the general principles. We know the importance of an audit charter. An audit charter gave us the authority and mandate to conduct the audits. With an internal team, the audit charter was signed then by either the audit committee of the board of directors or by the very highest levels of management. It documents who has the responsibility for the audit function, the authority of the auditors to be able to conduct audits and gather information, as well as then the scope of what is then covered within that audit area of responsibility. It's important that the audit team is somewhat independent of the organization. Organizational independence is difficult because obviously for administrative purposes such as payroll, audit must report to some department within the company. However, it's important then that auditors are still able to conduct the audits of even the department in which they will then report, whether or not that is HR or the legal area or operations, or very often into finance. This means that the audit function, being independent enough, can conduct independent, objective audits of all parts of the organization, and requires that auditors often have what we call a dotted line relationship to an audit committee or another manager outside of the chain of command. So if they have to conduct an audit in an area where there could be a perceived conflict of interest or undue management influence, they can then report outside then of their normal reporting structure. It is important that the auditors have a level of professional independence. In other words, they must be objective, both in appearance, that they don't appear to have a conflict of interest or a bias, but also in their attitude. When they conduct an audit, They must be an element of what we'll look at later, professional skepticism, that they are not easily influenced or make decisions that would appear to be based on influence or bias towards the area they are auditing. The general principles also refer to the reasonable expectations of the audit. If an audit is to be valid and valuable to the organization, there must be an expectation that the auditor was able to conduct the audit within the correct timelines and certainly according to then the standards and scope and information provided by management. It would be unreasonable to expect an auditor to complete an audit if there was not adequate time or whether the information provided was not complete or accurate by management. So it's an important element here of the general principles to identify if there are any limitations that could affect then the validity of the actual audit findings. Continuing with the general principles, every audit must be then conducted with due professional care. That means the audit was conducted in accordance with the standards that do apply, such as we're looking at here. Also, the auditor must have a level of proficiency, the skills and knowledge necessary to conduct the audit. They must maintain their competence through ongoing training. When an audit report is being then submitted, the auditor will make several assertions about the findings, their observations, conclusions, and recommendations. It is important that the audit findings or observations are valid. They are relevant to the area being audited, and they certainly are based on substantial evidence to ensure that that finding is something which truly is accurate and valid. We should have, of course, measurable criteria for the audit. The audit was conducted in a complete manner, that certainly an objective manner, as well as that the results are understandable and applicable to the area being audited. Those are the general principles. Now let's take a look at some of the performance principles that also apply as part of the ISACA standards. When I'm going to engage in an audit, remember an audit plan specifies the strategic plan, either short-term or long-term, but the audit plan then will be then broken down into individual audit engagements. Each audit engagement should support then the overall audit plan. And within the engagement, we should have clearly defined audit objectives to ensure that we have compliance with industry standards or various other types of policies or procedures, as well as then the audit engagement itself was based then on an understanding of the risk to that area, but also proper project planning techniques to ensure that our audit is completed within a reasonable time and budget. A lot of work in audit is going to be based on risk, as we call it risk-based auditing. We use an appropriate risk assessment approach. We look at the risk that's relevant to the area that is being audited, and we understand those risk factors that must be considered when we are gathering audit evidence, doing our findings, conclusions, and recommendations. We must also understand the audit risk. What is the risk of the audit not meeting its objectives, or where the subject matter experts are not available or don't provide the correct information necessary in conducting the actual audit? An audit must be performed with adequate supervision and, of course, performance requirements. This means that the audit is conducted according to then the stated audit engagement plan, and that audit staff has received appropriate supervision to ensure that, well, they only conduct tasks within their knowledge and skills, that the people performing the audit have been thorough, complete, objective, and independent, and that sufficient evidence has been gathered in order to then result in the audit findings and recommendations. All of the information should be then documented as audit work papers, and then we should ensure that we can trace any of the findings in the final report back to the work papers that actually identified that area. This is the performance then and supervision of a professionally conducted audit. When an audit is being conducted, the auditor must always consider the area of materiality. Materiality is there something significant that has been found, a significant deficiency or material weakness. A significant deficiency or material weakness is something which could pose a large risk or immediate risk to the organization. We must understand when we're considering materiality what would be the impact of audit risk on the audit timing, nature, and extent of the audit. Sometimes when an audit is being conducted, a material finding may actually change the scope, or we can say even sometimes the conduct of the audit. It could be that an audit needs to be adjusted because of a significant deficiency which has been uncovered. This means that we should look at what are the risks that are significant in themselves, but also not forget that sometimes even minor risks, when aggregated together, could lead to a cumulative large or significant impact. A lot of small problems may add up into a big problem. It is required then, when we find a significant deficiency or material weakness, we disclose it. We'll then state problems with missing, or should we say ineffective, controls. We'll identify the significance of that control deficiency. Is this something which is of immediate concern? And we'll then report on the probability of that weakness resulting then in a significant or material deficiency. When we've identified something, we must provide management then with a report on what we've found and the potential impact of that as a result. Other performance principles deal with the handling of evidence or audit work papers. In order to draw sufficiently accurate conclusions about the audit, we must obtain sufficient and appropriate evidence. This means that we have been thorough, complete, and ensured that any evidence we have then gathered is 1, complete, and 2, documented as part of the work papers. We will have to evaluate whether the evidence we do have has been truly sufficient to draw then the conclusions that are stated within the audit. Whenever we conduct an audit, we should always have our eyes open to any type of irregularities or illegal acts. As we conduct the audit, we should look, is there the risk here of fraud? Is there the risk of an irregularity or an illegal act that I would then uncover during the audit engagement? This means that when we are provided evidence and other types of documentation as part of the audit, we must always maintain an air of professional skepticism. It is important that when we conduct an audit, we don't just accept what we're given at face value, but in many cases we want to see the paper, we want to see the evidence, not just perhaps what a person has said. We maintain that professional skepticism that says, yes, thank you, but show me as well. We then must document any irregularities or illegal acts we find to the appropriate parties, and we must then communicate those in a timely manner. In some cases, when we find an irregularity or illegal act, we must report this outside of the normal audit reporting chain. And this is where we must have, as part of the audit charter then, what is then that reporting structure in that case. In some cases, when we conduct an audit, we will use the work of other experts, maybe previous auditors or specialists that have done work in this area. That is acceptable wherever it is appropriate. Now, That means we must ensure that that expert truly is an expert. We will assess and approve their qualifications, and we'll review their work to see is it complete, accurate, and certainly whether it's something we can use or leverage in our current audit engagement. Now, whether or not this work has been done as part of this audit or as part of another test or assessment will also determine whether or not we can use it in our audit engagement. And quite often, if it's timely, it's been done in the last short while, if it's complete and accurate, we can use it as part of our audit work as well. We then, of course, assess whether or not this work can be relied on as being accurate and, should we say, thorough. And in some cases, we'll do that through then applying additional tests ourselves, where there may be a risk that the audit work or the work done by the other expert is, should we say, incomplete. We'll then provide an audit opinion or conclusion, including in some cases a scope limitation where additional tests could not be conducted. In some cases, we must rely on work that has been done by another inspector or another person because it's impossible for us to get in and examine that now ourselves. That is something that certainly we can identify within the audit and in some cases list this as a scope limitation where we've had to rely on that outside expertise because we are unable then to conduct the tests in that area ourselves. The third part of this, after the general and performance, of course, are then the reporting standards. Reporting means that we'll provide a report to management to communicate the results of the audit at the conclusion of the engagement. In that audit report, we'll identify which enterprise or area has been then audited, who the recipients of this report should be, and any restrictions on the content and circulation of the audit report. In many cases, an audit report is an extremely sensitive document. And therefore, since it's listing the weaknesses or limitations of the organization is interested in preserving the confidentiality of that and distribution of that report as much as possible. We'll then provide in the report a documentation of the scope of the audit, as well as what were the objectives of this audit engagement. Were we trying to prove that a certain transaction, for example, was handled correctly, or a certain system is secure? We'll also specify the period in which the audit was conducted. One of the realities is that once an audit is done, well, things may change after that audit was finished as well. So we include the period of coverage of the audit, as well as the nature of the audit, the timing and extent of the work then performed during the audit engagement itself. That will look at things such as the intensity or depth of the audit, as well as then, of course, other limitations related to then the extent of work done. The audit report will always have findings, conclusions, and recommendations. It's important that we have these separate. A finding is something that has been then found or, should we say, discovered during the audit. That is a fact. The conclusions are then the auditor's interpretation of the findings. When we take a look at conclusions, we must understand they must be separate from fact, because a conclusion is an auditor's approach or an auditor's interpretation, not the actual fact itself. The auditor is also required to provide recommendations. A recommendation goes back to management and states that based on what we have found and our conclusions, that these are the suggestions we make as auditors that may help to address this problem. It is important for us as professional auditors to be willing to make recommendations based on the findings of the audit. We also will document within our report the qualifications of the people conducting the audit, as well as any qualifications about the validity of the audit, whether or not this can be trusted as an ongoing approach, or whether or not the audit itself may be limited in value due to other factors. We also will identify any limitations in scope. This is often where management was unwilling to provide access to certain information, or where we are unable to conduct the audit to the level of diligence that we would have preferred. We then will sign the report, date it, and distribute the audit report in accordance with the audit charter and engagement letter that specifies who should receive a copy of this report. Very often we'll have different copies of the report. We'll have an executive summary that goes to senior management and a more detailed audit report then that provides the information needed by the managers who will be responsible for responding to the audit recommendations. We must ensure that any of the findings in then the audit are truly factual. In other words, we can trace the finding in the audit report back to the audit work papers that will support then that finding is correct and based on sufficient and appropriate evidence. Next, we'll look at follow-up activities. And follow-up activities will monitor the relevant information to conclude whether management has planned or taken appropriate timely action to address any reported audit findings and recommendations. We then have the ISACA audit guidelines. We've just looked at the standards, and the guidelines are put in place to provide support for the implementation of those standards. In summary, audits must follow professional standards. The examination that you are going to face as a CISA candidate will test your understanding of the concepts related to the standards we have just discussed. It is not necessary to know the numbering scheme used by ISACA when they then document these standards.